Winter came early, in late September, with 3 feet of heavy snow. Steve began first grade at the ranch school on the hill half a mile above the apartment building. A young single woman taught all 6 grades of elementary school, with help from 2 assistants. She often became perplexed and cross with Steve. He did not attend well, often staring out the window while she was talking. He doodled on his lined tablet and sometimes wandered away during group activities. She wondered if he heard anything she said. One gray, dead of winter day in January, she sat him down to test his math comprehension. She focused closely on him and said, "I've been watching you during your recesses. You are smart, Steve. You organize the other first graders and invent games to play. So why won't you even try in class? You are never able to get more than 3 addition flashcards right. And the other first graders need to move on to subtraction. You are not ready, and you should be. I think you just aren't trying." She said, "Now, Steve, I'm going to show you flashcards with addition problems just like the ones we've been learning on the blackboard. I want you to tell me what you get when you add the 2 numbers, okay?" Steve looked into her face. She seemed very serious about the matter. "Okay," he answered hesitantly. She had held up the first card he answered with the correct sum. She smiled and slid the card to the back of the stack. Presenting the next card to him, he answered with the correct answer, then looked away to see what the other kids were doing. The flashcard activity seemed very dry and boring to him. She was obviously asking about what she already knew. It seemed fairly pointless and tediously dull to answer such simple questions. "Steve, pay attention," she demanded. She showed him another card. He answered with a random number, not bothering to actually read the card. She frowned and tried the next card. He gave another incorrect sum. She tried a few more, staring very sternly at him. He only got one more correct. Suddenly she lost her temper, grabbed a ruler and whipped his bottom with it. He cried out and stepped back from her. His total attention was riveted on her face. Why had she lashed out at him, he wondered desperately. "Now, Steve, you are not even trying to get the right answer. You are going to pay attention and learn your addition facts. If you don't start paying attention and at least try to get the right answer, I'm going to whip you hard with this ruler. Do you understand me?" She angrily scolded him. With shining eyes and his mind racing in fear and confusion, he answered, "Yes, I'll try, teacher." She composed herself for a minute, then more calmly instructed, "Okay, I'm going to go through all the cards and tell you the answers. You try to learn what each card adds up to, and then I'll go through them again and see how many you know." Steve shook his head in anxious acknowledgement and concentrated while she presented each card and told him the sum of the values factored on it. As she went through the deck of 25 cards again, Steve answered the correct sum almost instantly. She looked incredulously at him and quickly cycled through the deck a third time. He answered every one correctly again, but at an even faster rate. With flushed cheeks and wide eyes, she queried, "Steve, how did you just do that? You didn't even have time to read the cards. How could you say the answer so quick?" Steve stared at her, and the fear of inciting her anger again rose up in him. "I'm trying to do it right, teacher," he cried out with tears rushing down his cheeks. She reached out and clasped his hands together in her palms. "Oh, Steve, no. No, you did do it right. You answered wonderfully. How come you didn't tell me the right answers before?" She reassured him with a little bit of wonderment in her voice. "I know these numbers. I don't know," he answered sheepishly and looked away. He was not used to being shown such curious attention. The teacher stood up and patted him on the shoulder. Seeming on a whim, his teacher grabbed a deck of multiplication flashcards, a subject she had not taught to the first grade. Not only did Steve give mostly correct answer products, he also gave answers to flashcards she had not exposed yet. She became exceedingly excited. She stood up and put the cards down. "How is this possible, Steve? Do your parents teach you multiplication?" she demanded. Steve became very frightened, and his mind quickly shut down. He mumbled, "No, I don't know whatever you said. Just don't spank me." "That's okay, Steve. You can go play with the others now," she said as she dismissed him. When school was over, Steve's teacher gave him an envelope. She told him, "Steve, I want you to make sure you take this home to your mother and give it to her as soon as you get home." Steve was very curious about the letter, and he felt important being able to carry it home with him. He gave it to his mother, and she became excited when she read it. "Your teacher says she gave you a math test today, and you did very well. Is that right, Steve?" Steve looked puzzled, and then replied, "Well, she showed me cards with numbers on them. She said I had to say what the numbers added to. She got mad and hit me with a ruler. But then, when I did them another time, she was happy." That night at dinner, Rosie proudly announced to Joe that Steve's teacher had sent a letter home, stating that he had done very well in math that day. She went on to say that the teacher thought Steve might have a photographic memory because he wasn't paying attention to the addition problems, but when she went through the cards and told him the answers, he could always give her the right answer again, even after she shuffled the cards. Joe smiled grimly and said, "Well, I don't know about any photographic memory, but I'm glad to hear he's learning arithmetic. We've got to teach him something or he'll never amount to a damn." Steve lay in bed very early in the morning, listening to the quiet murmur of conversation between his mom and dad, sitting at the kitchen table. He had often awoken at 4 or 5 in the morning to hear his mother quietly discussing a problem or an observation that his father had just quietly spoken. Steve could rarely actually hear what his old daddy had to say in his quiet, thin voice. It was usually his mother's slightly louder and more piercing replies that gave Steve a clue as to what the discussion was about. He heard his mother say, "I don't read tea leaves very often. Mama always said it was wrong, from the devil, or at least maybe black magic," she said. Both parents were quiet for several seconds before Joe commented, "What's so evil about looking at the grounds in your teacup?" Rosie replied, "Well, you know, they say it ain't right to know the future, but sometimes I can see some of my own future in those tea leaves." "Your future? What future?" "I've dreamed of all my kids before I had them. I've dreamed of places I would live long before I lived there. For instance, I don't know how this could ever happen, but I have dreamed that you and I and the boys will live in a big, nice house with a laundry chute and a food elevator, like they have in fancy hotels." "Food elevator? What the hell is that?" "Well, I think I've heard of them called a dumbwaiter or something like that," was all Rosie replied. Joe was quiet for several minutes. Finally, so quiet that Steve could barely make it out, Joe said, "Well, honey, if we were ever living in a house like that, we would have to be rich. You and I both know that is never going to happen. You take these tea leaf visions too serious. You know we will never live in a house like that." Rosie was quiet for a while before replying, "Well, maybe you're right. We may never do that well. But you never know. Really, reading tea leaves is kind of like my premonition dreams to me, and I know that my dreams always come true in my life. Maybe my tea leaves will work the same way." Steve learned later in life that his mother had correctly predicted several key elements in her life based upon premonition dreams. Chapter 11. Alexis Creek. The next spring, the gang ranch manager, Wade Rollins, left the ranch to start his own spread. He invited Joe to come work for him. The ranch was located north of Gang Ranch, near the little town of Alexis Creek in midwestern British Columbia. It seemed like a probable step towards his dream of owning his own homestead, so Joe agreed and packed up the old Ford pickup. The Gandys drove east to the Alaska Highway, turned north, and then traveled over 50 miles west, down a rugged gravel road to the new ranch. The place straddled a one-lane dusty gravel road. Alexis Creek was a small town 2 miles further west. It was a cool but sunny spring day when Joe pulled the pickup up the dirt driveway of a log cabin adjacent to the road. It was an ancient homesteader's place that had been abandoned for some time. Cattle had gained access to its single room and had caused considerable damage to the walls and floor. Rosie looked inside the door, turned around, and got back into the pickup. While she cried softly, Joe unpacked a shovel and began heaving loads of fetid cow manure out of the cabin through the one door. Rosie strongly insisted on finding another place to live. Even though this was the only dwelling the rancher had to offer, she did not see how the four of them could live in the tiny, square, one-room cabin. Its interior measured about 15 feet to a side. There was no electricity, nor running water. 2 of the 3 windows had broken panes, and the third was boarded over. Cattle hooves had broken the flooring, exposing about a quarter of the floor space to packed dirt. The sod roof was insulated with earth, out of which a small spruce tree and some bushes grew. Joe was equally dismayed, but responded in his usual stoic fashion. "Rosie, this is where the boss said we are to live, so we better make the best of it for now," Joe encouraged. Rosie dejectedly but methodically transformed the cattle shelter back into a human habitation. She hung blankets on clotheslines as partitions, forming 3 separate spaces. There was the main living area that the small door opened onto, with an old wood cook stove that Joe quickly repaired to partial functionality. 2 smaller spaces served as separate bedrooms for the parents and the 2 boys. He attached a couple of boards to the long walls to serve as both utensil shelves and pantry. Within the first 2 weeks, Rosie angrily exterminated 3 large pack rats that had been living under the exposed remaining section of floorboards. She sharpened the end of the broom handle to a point and used it to impale the rodents. They were about the size of small house cats and fought back loudly with vicious claws and inch-long incisors. Fresh, cold water was available from the little spring 50 yards below the other side of the gravel road. This was just down the hill from the cabin and across the road, about 100 feet away. The outhouse was more convenient, where Joe dug it, behind the cabin, and only about 40 feet away. It was a quiet place, with only a few vehicles passing by a few times a day. However, the first weekend of their stay, they discovered an unfortunate aspect of their proximity to the road and Alexis Creek. A native North American Indian reservation was located a few miles east of them, with the town only 2 miles to their west. Every Saturday night, natives would find a way into Alexis Creek, become stumbling drunk, and then attempt to walk back to the reservation. By the time they made it to the Gandhi's cabin, they were often sick and belligerent. Many Sundays, in the early hours of the morning, the cabin would be assaulted by heavy pounding on the little door. "Hey! Hey! Hey, you! Mister! Take me to the reservation!" they demanded. After several minutes of negotiations, Joe would often get dressed and drive him, her, or them down the road to the reservation. He told Rosie, "When they're drinking fire water, there's no reasoning with them. They want to pay me in beer. It doesn't matter how many times I tell them I don't drink." As spring warmed into summer, Steve and Clyde ventured farther and farther away from the cabin. They played games in the pasture behind the cabin, the forest above the pasture, and in the small barn across the road. There were no nearby neighbors, so the boys had no opportunity for interaction with anyone except themselves. This did not bother them, though, because they had lived in isolation since they were born. The pasture was home to the small ranch's horse population. Most of the horses stayed by the horse barn near the rancher's house, about a mile northeast of the cabin. However, there was a young Shetland pony that wandered away from the other horses and often came to the part of the pasture where the cabin was. Steve found that when he was quiet and moved slowly up to the Shetland, it would let him rub its mane. He became fascinated with a pony small enough